Welcome to Middleweight Politics Political Analysis for the Independent Voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Sean Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who does not align with either major party, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who feels we need more than two choices on the ballot, welcome home. Now, we've talked a lot on this podcast about how many of us go to the ballot box feeling we have to hold our nose and vote for the lesser of two evils. But would you believe that there are voters who in the last election cast ballots for candidates they were really enthusiastic about? Too bad it's only 2% of the population. We're going to talk about this jolly group of voters in a bit. But first, Sean, I've got a question for you.
Yeah, what's up?
Do we have a president anymore?
I don't. You asked a very good question because even following this shutdown stuff today, people have been asking, where's Biden?
Yeah,
how's Biden been involved in this? It's a genuine question because I haven't heard anything about or from Biden in a while.
No. So we're recording this on Friday, December 20th. This is going to come out on Monday, the 23rd. As of now, the government is going to be shut down tomorrow. So the government is running out of money tomorrow. Trump is in the headlines. And Biden is literally like, oh, I don't know, ask the new guy. You know, he is like a jilted shift worker at Burger King on his last day of work. It's ridiculous.
He's just ready to he's ready to just get that final paycheck and go home. But yeah, it's interesting because Trump has said that he wants, if there's going to be a shutdown, he wants it to happen while Biden's in office. And Biden doesn't seem like he cares.
Yeah, I think if there's the perfect Democratic answer to January 6th, it's the president quiet quitting,
Right.
I think that's very on brand. Well, with that out of the way, I think, that opens the door for the first thing we wanted to talk about, which was some of the fracturing we're seeing within the two major parties. And I think we can actually start with this shutdown debate. So if you've listened to this podcast before, you'll know that Sean and I tend to view America's political system as a multi-party system that unfortunately is being crammed into two major parties. And right now, what we're seeing on the Republican side is the friction that can cause. So this deal was tanked by budget hawks within the Republican Party, primarily from the Freedom Caucus. So, the usual suspects, Paul Gosar, Nancy Mace, and so on. And what we're seeing is this failure to be able to engage in a critical function of the legislature, which is creating a budget, due to the fact that one party can't agree and they can't get any members of the other party on board.
Right. Yeah. And to speak to this idea that if we had a truly democratic process that represented how people wanted to vote and wanted to represent, their constituents, we would have a multi-party system. You can look at the fact that a lot of the Republicans who are bucking their own party and their own president-elect at this point are the same politicians who got elected during the Tea Party movement. Like Republicans like Chip Roy, who are railing against their colleagues on the House floor for increasing spending. But when the Tea Party movement came about, they didn't have the option of just forming their own party and getting into power that way. No, they had to infiltrate the Republican Party, take it over, and now it's being infiltrated again by MAGA, who seems only interested in what Trump wants rather than, these promises of fiscal responsibility, which is what is the concern of these the Freedom Caucus people, because they have primary voters back at home that they promise that they would do X, Y, and Z on fiscal policy. One of those is not increased spending. And you're talking about trillions of dollars of increased spending. So they're in a tight spot.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we've talked about is if you look at democracies globally over the last 10-ish or so years, what we've seen are the establishment center left and center right parties lose ground to far left and far right parties, right? And what we saw happen in the US, of course, during that same period was a fragmenting of the parties themselves. So there's no real new party formation. It's just the parties are having a much, much tougher time getting on the same page. And I think we see that with the Freedom Caucus. That actually brings us to the second story on the other side of the aisle, which is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez losing her bid to become ranking member of the House Oversight Committee to Jerry Conley, a 74-year-old 9-term congressman with esophageal cancer. So way to learn your lessons from the last election, Democrats. But I think this highlights another tension, which is, again, between the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the establishment wing, which clearly at this point is winning.
I think you're seeing an interesting contrast between the two parties. We talked about before how the Democratic Party is the stronger of the two parties in terms of their institution. When they need to, they can get all of their candidates, all their people to vote on the same page. Right now, you're seeing that in the shutdown debate. All the Democrats are going to vote on the same page, regardless of if they're more in the progressive wing or the more establishment wing of the party. But there is this tension between what is colloquially referred to as the old guard of the Democratic Party that kind of wants to maintain their control until the next generation of leaders, kind of the wait in line. People like AOC who have been able to create their own brand for themselves and have become popular. But on the other side with the Republicans, again, this contrast of they can keep their voters kind of voting on the same page, but they can't keep their candidates that are politicians. Yeah, so it's this very interesting contrast that you're seeing between the two parties right now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think within the Democratic Party, what you see is this fear in the establishment that if they veer too hard into the progressive wing, it's going to cost them elections. Now, you could argue that the Republicans have proven that isn't the case because the MAGA wing is clearly the right wing of the party. They're clearly taking an anti-establishment position. And at the same time, you can't really say it's hurt them to a huge degree. It certainly cost them elections, but they're also entering into 2024 with a trifecta.
See, I wonder if part of the issue is some of the people like Nancy Pelosi see the emergence of progressives like AOC as a potential hindrance to success, in that if you have these progressive leaders emerge and become like the established leaders of the party, if the Republicans are going to be able to just play their culture games more.
Oh, yeah.
And still, but the thing about that is Republicans are already winning on that. They're already winning on being able to utilize that to their advantage. Whether or not they actually have public support on a lot of these cultural issues, which on many of them they don't, but they're still winning on the narrative, and they're still being able to keep Democrats in this mindset of, you have to think this way. We cannot have conversation about it. We cannot diverge from our path.
Well, and I think too, when we talk about success, let's keep in mind what we're talking about in terms of margins. Like, they won the House. Yes, they've got a very thin margin.
Right.
They won the White House with under 50% of the popular vote. It's not like they're running away with it, but they're winning just enough at the fringes to get them over the line. And I would also say that these victories also come on the heels of a very unpopular administration. They come on the heels of inflation. They come on the heels of a housing crisis, a cost of living crisis. All these things are, I think, way more in the minds of voters than how woke the party is. And I think what we're going to see in the coming 6 to 12 months is we're going to see those tables turn. And all of a sudden, Trump is going to be shouldering the blame, and the Republicans are going to be shouldering the blame for the situation. And of course, they'll blame it on the prior administration, which is natural. Anybody would do it. But voters have shown that that doesn't carry a lot of water with them. Now, the one thing I find really interesting, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is Elon Musk and his role. Mm-hmm. Because he actually came out first to oppose the spending deal before Trump did. And then Trump and his camp came out front and made sure that everybody knew that Trump was against it before Elon was against it. They didn't want to make it look like Elon was guiding policy. But the interesting thing, I think, is that somebody like Musk actually might open the door for reforms that could potentially allow for a little more competition in elections. And I'll give you my reasoning behind this. So, if you look at people in office, their main concern, above and beyond whatever altruistic motive they might have, is gaining and preserving power, right? And if there's a system that's going to help them gain and preserve power, they're going to support it. If there's one that potentially threatens that, they're going to oppose it. And what we see is that democracy doesn't exist because it's the right thing to do. It exists because powerful people feel that's the best way to allocate power. That's it, right? And so to that end, part of the reason we only have two parties is because our system of elections only allows two, or makes it very, very difficult for more than two parties to gain traction. Now, Musk has used his money to help get Trump elected, right? And he's also threatened to bankroll primary challenges to Republicans who fall out of line. And so you have this one person outside the political system who is threatening the ability for a number of people in Washington to preserve their power. And in my mind, as the circle of people who are outside of the party system, so as the number of progressive Democrats left out in the cold and the number of centrist Republicans left out in the cold grows, my question is, will these people who know how to get power and how to wield it start to support a system that blunts the influence of people like Musk, or blunts the influence of a certain cadre within a political party to crowd a number of other policy choices out?
It certainly would be ironic if Elon Musk, who has wanted to take advantage of the current system that we have by asserting his influence both as an influential figure and a very vocal figure on his own app X, but also with his money, trying to influence policy by money really alone, being the catalyst that brings about more reform in the U.S. That would be the very definition of ironic if he was the one that led that change. But I will say this. I think just like Trump is kind of an extreme example of what's wrong with our system today, I think you're seeing that with Musk as well. You have a Democratic Party that is so afraid of going to the left that they've become out of touch with their constituents and their base voters. And so while they're capable of governing as an institution, they just preserve the status quo. They don't actually affect change at all. And then you have the Republican Party, and this is kind of maybe a more dangerous situation in the next 4 years, where they're so fractured that they are incapable of governing. Like just being the House Speaker is a headache of a job right now, because at any moment somebody within your own caucus could try to oust you and then replace you.
So much to say there. First off, I am pretty much convinced that the way you become the Republican House Speaker is by wishing on one of those cursed monkey's paws, because that is a thankless job, right? Number two, the thing I find funniest about Elon Musk is he is doing in broad daylight what the right has been saying George Soros has been doing behind the scenes for years. He is literally bankrolling a party. And he launches satellites into space, right? Some of which may or may not be classified in nature. The fact that the party that wants to drain the swamp is also rallying behind the involvement of one of the biggest beneficiaries of government subsidies and government contracts is astounding. SpaceX, entirely government funded. Tesla, entirely funded by renewable energy credits. It is not a car company. It's a loophole.
Well, yeah, Elon Musk is the richest man in the world because of U.S. taxpayers.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think to your point, it would be outrageously ironic if he were the catalyst for this change. Now, the interesting thing, there were a couple of polls that came out from Fair Vote that I know you and I got that I want to talk about that sort of address this. We'll start with the bad news, and then we'll move on to the good news, which is also kind of bad news in and of itself, but we'll explain that in a bit. The first poll they ran was of voters in the last elections, and the question they asked was, did you feel like you were voting for the lesser of two evils in at least one election? 47% of respondents said yes. But it gets worse. 46% said no, less than yes, right? So fewer people said they were not voting for the lesser of two evils. And then there's a segment that said, I don't know, or unsure, which, like, if you're unsure, you were voting for the lesser of two evils. Like, I mean, come on. Like, so I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's something that I've written about for a while now, and it's something that we continue to see with the public. And again, a system that forces people to choose between two sides, where those candidates, and I wrote about this past week about how these are the same candidates, just election cycle after election cycle after election cycle. Even when the name changes, they tend to be the exact same type of candidate. And what you find is that these candidates are increasingly unpopular with the public. We saw this with Trump. Trump didn't win based on his popularity with the public. I mean, he didn't even get 50% of the popular national popular vote. So I think the system continuing the way it is, you're going to keep seeing this. I think maybe in the next election cycle, maybe 4 years from now, you see that go above a majority. And it's so close right now, but I think that's conceivable in the near future that for the first time we see a majority of voters say that they voted for the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, I think there's only so long you can have candidates whose favorability is underwater
Yeah.
before they even take office,
Mm.
before people, before people just start to tune out. Now, the interesting bright spot was another poll by Fair Vote, which shows that third party voters were actually much more enthusiastic about their choices. So Fair Vote released another poll polling people who cast ballots for a third party candidate in 2024. And somewhere in the neighborhood of about 70% of them said they were voting because the candidate matched their values and that they felt it was the right choice. There were a percentage who cast ballots as a rejection of their choices of the two major parties. But what I found interesting about the poll was that you had more people voting for their candidate than against another candidate, as you saw with the two major party candidates.
And what's interesting to me is that when I look at the poll and I look at the breakdown of it, you see this very interesting contrast when it came to Stein voters in particular. Because Stein voters were more likely to say that they were voting to make a statement against the two major parties or against a particular systemic issue than they were because Stein shared their values,
Mhm.
as opposed to Kennedy or the Libertarian nominee as well, which speaks to this idea that we're seeing this contrast again between the two major parties, where the Republicans can keep their voters pretty much well in line. Like Republican voters are going to vote Republican pretty much down ballot. You're not going to see much dissension with the voters. Democratic voters, though, we're starting to see in greater numbers when they're not happy with their party, they're willing to go vote for a third party candidate or just not vote at all. It
Mm-hmm.
seems.
Yeah. Well, and the other interesting thing about Stein voters, which I think reflects what you're saying about the Democrats too, is that in this poll, Stein voters were the most likely to say they would have cast a vote for Trump
Yeah.
if there were only two candidates. So the majority of poll respondents, 55% of third party voters, said they would have cast a ballot for Donald Trump if there were only two choices on the ballot. 27% said Harris, 13% said they wouldn't vote, and then 5% were undecided. For Stein, that number was 66% would have cast a
Hmm.
ballot for Trump. And I really have to wonder whether that's less to do with any ideological affinity for Trump and more of a mix of an anti establishment sentiment, but more importantly, resentment over the Democratic Party's continuous efforts to knock them off the ballot going back 20 years. I feel like there's a lot of animosity there. And the interesting thing here is I think this again gets back to the problem that our system faces, which is you have the Green Party and the Democratic Party two parties that should be natural allies fighting for the same pool of voters. And as a result, the Democratic Party is taking decidedly undemocratic means to limit the choices of Green Party voters.
I mean, you saw that a lot. You saw that in the headlines. I wrote about this as well. The Democratic Party's efforts to suppress the Green Party's ability to be on the ballot in the first place, not even to allow Stein to be on the ballot. And what is interesting to your point is that even Kennedy voters, less Kennedy voters, said that if there were only two options, they would vote for Trump. And Kennedy endorsed Trump. And Stein is on the complete opposite side in terms of her policy rhetoric of the ideological spectrum than Trump is. So, yes, absolutely. It's this issue of resentment toward the Democratic Party for what has been very undemocratic approaches to not only preserving the leadership that they have within their own party, but also preventing any type of additional choice from being on the ballot that could be the spoiler to their candidate, which of course we found out in this election because of this poll. It wasn't spoiled for Harris this time around.
And I think that there's a bright spot in this poll for reformers as well, or for reform in general, which is if you look at the number of people who wouldn't have voted if there was no other choice, that equates to about 300,000 voters nationally. So not a huge amount, but not a small amount either, right? And so I think what that tells us is that more choices on the ballot do encourage more people to participate in the process. And mind you, that's a population that knows their candidate isn't going to win. So these are people going to the ballot box knowing they don't stand a chance of seeing their candidate in the White House, and yet they show up anyway. And so you have to wonder, would that number be bigger if there was a shot? Would that number be bigger if we had ranked choice voting, for example?
I think it all depends on the candidate and the party, to be honest. I think right now what you're seeing percentage-wise for, say, the Green Party in the national vote, what you're seeing for the Libertarian Party, is a reflection of their overall membership nationwide. These are two parties that appeal to ideological niches, so they don't have the broadest support. But I think under a ranked choice method, if you encouraged parties that had a more broad appeal to them, if you had something like ranked choice voting, you would incentivize those voters to want to prioritize their top preference, and that could open the door for the right third party or the right third parties. But again, I think because in the article that I wrote earlier this week, I made the point that when you look at the candidates on the ballot, I'm not sure if ranked choice voting would have changed anything this cycle in terms of how people voted. Because again, we're seeing the same candidates each election cycle, right? Trump's ran the last 3 cycles, right? Harris was just an extension of the Biden administration. That's how she had to campaign. And then Stein has been the Green Party nominee 3 times now. So it's again, just the same names, a different election cycle. So I think opening the door for that type of competition, I think will allow third party to emerge. It would take some time, but I do think if you offered a voting method like ranked choice voting, you would see more voters vote the way they want rather than this. I'm voting for this person because I think they're the least of the evils.
I think one thing that's clear, and if we bring it back to some of the battles going on in the House, it's that there are voters supporting different policy choices within the major party system, right? There are your AOC voters, there are your Pelosi voters, there are your Trump voters, there are your Nikki Haley voters, right? There are factions within those parties. I think if these factions were allowed to express their policy differences in the form of forming alternate parties, I think you'd see a lot more enthusiasm. I think you'd see a lot more participation. To be frank, I think you'd see a lot more actual campaigning.
Oh, I agree.
So we are going to leave it there. If you liked what you heard today, please rate this episode, please leave it a review, and please share it with anyone you feel might need to hear this. We will be taking a break next week, but we will be back after the new year. Theme music courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you for listening to Middleweight Politics. And am I one of those people who says, see you next year? You bet your sweet ass I am. See you next year. Stay purple.